Sex trafficking is one of the world's fastest growing crimes, but it's important to understand what exactly sex trafficking is. Sex trafficking is the action or practice of illegally transporting people from one country or area to another for the purpose of sexual exploitation. This can be for money, health, drugs, or food. It's important to note that sex trafficking has been around for a while, though it took other forms or titles, such as forced prostitution, war-induced comfort woman, or raping. We saw that in Japan in World War II, personal use, or use in the work environment. There has been evolution to sex trafficking, and this is due to technology increasing ability and access to sexual trafficking victims, decrease in global value of life, leading to the need for money and food and healthcare, sexualization due to modern culture and climate, and marginalization, leading to more areas being subjected to sex trafficking. So we understand what sex trafficking is, but now it's important to understand why, where, who, and how it happens. So why does sex trafficking occur? The main reason is exploitation, the act or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. This can be work for money or labor, and in this case, sex trafficking is both. The victim does these things for the benefit of the perpetrator. Now that it's clear why sex trafficking occurs, where does it happen? You may think, because this world seems so big, that sex trafficking occurs in one small area or maybe even region, but the reality is sex trafficking can occur anywhere. Though statistics say that economically, socially, and politically marginalized communities have higher likelihoods of being subjected to sex trafficking. This is for three main reasons: social patterns in the victim's community or family that lead to them being sex trafficked, search or need for a better life, and means of survival. Now that we've covered what, why, where, it's important to understand who, and the answer is anyone can be sex trafficked. Races and ethnicities, ages, gender, or location are really irrelevant, though statistics do say that Black women between the ages of 12 to 22 who are economically inferior are at a higher risk and are more targeted to being sex trafficked. Nearly 60% of all sex trafficking victims fall under these categories. Lastly, how does this happen? The umbrella term for how victims are lured and maintained in captivity are called tactics and grooming methods. These include force, money, love, safety, fear, threatening, lying, blackmailing, or coercion, and these are done by the perpetrator in order to keep control over the victim. Now that we've gone over the basics, let's learn about the impact of sex trafficking. Sex trafficking does not only impact the victim. Although there is an obvious individual effect, communities and even the globe are affected. There is an obvious impact on the individuals that are subjected to sex trafficking, and this can include mental damage and impacts. Part of this can be depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. There can be a change in outlook on the victim's self-image, which can result in low self-esteem, also a mental issue. Then there are clear physical damages that can occur due to beating and just sexual abuse, like broken limbs and bones, cuts and bruises, STDs, HPV, AIDS, and trauma. As well as the physical effects, there are social effects like self-induced isolation, social anxiety, and detachment from friends, family, and the world. So it could be hard to believe that sex trafficking does have effects beyond just the person being trafficked. Communities are affected, and some communities are even run by the money and income from sex trafficking. Countries like Taiwan, India, China, and various other countries are all dependent on the income from sex trafficking boosting their economy. Social patterns within areas and communities are also affected due to sex trafficking, and this is because the effect that sex trafficking has on victims, families, and neighborhoods is immense. These social patterns can lead to sex trafficking, and in most cases even make it worse. This problem is referred to as marginalization, which creates concentration for sex trafficking communities. So how does sex trafficking manage to affect on a global scale? It's a violation of human rights. To go into more depth, the UN has established 30 human rights that are not laws but regulations, and sex trafficking violates the right to life, liberty, and security, the right to freedom of movement, and the right to not be subjected to torture and cruel, inhumane punishments and treatments. This essentially makes sex trafficking modern-day slavery, and the sex trafficking victims are the slaves. As well as this, sex trafficking leads to globalization, and there are pros and cons to this, but essentially, globalization is the spread of people from different areas in the world to another, and in the definition of sex trafficking, that is basically what it is. Sex trafficking is recognized as a large-scale problem in most places, and there have been solutions in attempt to combat this problem. Some of these solutions include organizations such as the Polaris Project, the Anti-Slavery International, and Stop the Traffic. These organizations focus on spreading awareness and raising money towards stopping sex trafficking. Another way sex trafficking is being combated is through the spreading of information and awareness on the subject. This is in schools, newspapers, public areas, and transportation, and this is to prevent and be able to spot sex trafficking as it occurs. Victimization is another factor that is helping to prevent sex trafficking, and this is never blaming the victim. If victims know they won't get in trouble, they're more likely to speak up. Except sex trafficking still exists, so are these methods effective? And what's making them ineffective? So, to answer that question, yes, some of the methods are effective and are decreasing numbers slightly of sex trafficking victims, as well as increasing reports, arrests, and information given to police. People have been influenced to speak up, which is a huge factor in preventing sex trafficking. People who see, hear, or know of someone who needs help are speaking up, and this is helpful. Now to tap into some of the barriers to sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is an underground industry, and this is partially due to modern technology supplying websites that are encrypted, therefore leaving no trail. Lack of criminalization in a multitude of countries has also left sex trafficking not illegal and therefore a huge problem. And next, the idea of shame and fear revolving around sex trafficking victims. This makes them scared to report their problems. This ties into the stigmas that tell people that this is a less important or dirty problem, and that just because it doesn't involve them, they shouldn't get involved and try and stop it. The unescapable cycle of sex trafficking goes from the buyer, who supplies a demand, to the supplier, or the pimp, who supplies the victim, who is the supply. And this circle goes round and round because of grooming tactics and no ability or choice to escape, leaving the buyer with the money and therefore power. In order to break this cycle, the buyer and the pimp have to be taken out, abolishing the shame that the victim may feel and never blaming the victim. So, how does sex trafficking relate to previous units and issues and themes that we have focused on in class? Thinking about this is a really interesting way to reevaluate how things like money and capitalism and communism and all of the issues that we learned about in class can actually take effect on other issues like they did in sex trafficking. For example, when communism was relevant, specifically in the USSR, after the fall of communism, there was economic depression, and because of this, there was uber rich people and uber poor people. This led to the uber rich people having the money and therefore power to buy sex slavery and, I guess, indulge on things that they never had the opportunity to with communism.
So another obvious thing that we've gone over is globalization, and that's the spread of people. This has been talked about in our past units with imperialism and through wars and
globalization influencing multitudes of things, and sex trafficking is one of them.